Have you ever loved a song so much, played it over and over without ever getting tired of it? But then one day, out of nowhere, you heard it again and it suddenly sounded utterly bland? Have you ever been infatuated with a flavor, only to taste it a few more times and find it terrible? For a chef like me, updating flavors and chasing food trends is inevitable. But there was one thing I never changed in over 50 years. My wedding anniversary cake, the one my wife and I shared. She used to say, "I love the taste of that cake the way I love you." I trusted that sentence for more than half my life. I believed blindly that the recipe was absolute. I never imagined that sentence carried a hidden meaning. I was simply too foolish to see it. That's right. It was sitting right there on my daughter's birth certificate. Well, I should say, my daughter's. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I was sitting at the desk in the back office of the restaurant with 3 boxes of old paperwork open in front of me. 40 years of health permits, supplier invoices, and family records I had never bothered to sort because I never thought I would need to. Meg needed her birth certificate for a passport application. She was turning 54 this winter, and she had decided after a lifetime of never leaving South Carolina that she wanted to see Paris before she got too old to enjoy it properly. I told her I would find the document. I had told her that 3 days ago. I found it folded inside a manila envelope stamped with the seal of Beaufort County, 1971. The paper had gone the color of weak tea. I unfolded it carefully, the way I handle anything that has survived longer than it was built to. Margaret Elaine Pruitt, born January the 14th. Mother Corinne Delacroix Pruitt. Father Wendell Ashford Pruitt. That much was exactly what it should have been. Then I turned the certificate toward the window light because my eyes are not what they used to be. And I saw it. In the margin along the left edge, someone had written a name in pencil so faint it had nearly vanished into the paper's grain. Not an official notation, not a clerk's stamp. A name written small, the way a person writes something they intend to erase later and never do. Calloway. I sat with that word for a long time. I want to say I understood immediately what it meant, but that would be a lie. And I have decided, sitting here now, that I am done telling lies, even small ones, even to myself. What I felt first was confusion. A misprint, a clerk's error. I turned the paper over, looking for some explanation on the back, and found nothing but the county seal and a stain shaped like a coffee ring that had been there longer than Meg had been alive. I thought absurdly of Corinne's voice, that same sentence she'd repeated every October for 54 years, while I cut her a slice of that same cake. I love the taste of that cake the way I love you. I had always taken it as the kind of tender, slightly silly thing a wife says to keep a small tradition alive. Sitting there with a stranger's name pressed into the margin of my daughter's birth record, I heard it differently. For the first time, not as tenderness, but as a sentence built entirely out of something I had never once been given the whole of. I do not know how long I sat there. Long enough that the light through the window moved from one corner of the desk to the other. Long enough that Dolores knocked twice on the office door to ask if I wanted the walk-in restocked before the lunch rush, and I told her in a voice that did not sound like mine that I would be out in a minute. I was not out in a minute. Corinne's mother's recipe, she had always called it. A family recipe, passed down sacred in the particular way that food becomes sacred in families that do not talk easily about anything else. I had spent 50 years believing I was simply not good enough to honor it properly, and the thought sat in me like a stone I had swallowed accidentally and learned to live around. I looked at the name in the margin again. Calloway. I did not know a single Calloway in Beaufort. Not one in 55 years of living in this town, of running this kitchen, of shaking every hand that walked through the door on a Sunday after church. And yet something in me, some part that had been listening for a long time without telling the rest of me what it heard, recognized that name the way you recognize a smell from childhood before you can name what's cooking. I folded the certificate back along its original creases. I did not know yet what I was going to do with it. I only knew that I was not going to hand it to Meg today, not with her passport application sitting half-finished on the kitchen counter at home, not with her humming to herself about Paris the way she'd hummed since she was 8 years old. And I taught her to crack an egg one-handed over the mixing bowl. I put the paper in the inside pocket of my jacket against my chest, where I could feel the shape of it through the fabric for the rest of the day. Then I walked out into the kitchen, and I told Dolores to go ahead and restock the walk-in, and I picked up a knife, and I did what I have always done with the things I could not yet carry. I went back to work. Corinne has made the same pot of tea every morning for as long as I have known her, in the same white porcelain teapot, with the hairline crack running down one side that she refuses to let me glue or replace. I used to think that crack was sentimental. I used to think a great many things without asking why I thought them. I came home a little after 5, later than usual because I had stayed at the restaurant longer than the paperwork required. I told Dolores I wanted to finish the supplier reconciliation before the weekend, which was true in the way that a small true thing can sit on top of a larger one and keep it from showing through. Corinne was in the kitchen when I came in, standing at the stove with her back to the door, and the kettle was just starting to whistle. "You're late," she said, not turning around. Not an accusation, just an observation the kind married people make instead of asking questions they already suspect they won't like the answers to. "Paperwork," I said. "Tax season doesn't care what season it actually is." She laughed at that, a small sound, and poured the water into the teapot the way she always did, in a slow, circular motion, like she was stirring something invisible. I stood in the doorway and watched her do it. This thing I had watched her do perhaps 20,000 times across 55 years, and for the first time in my life, I found myself looking at the teapot itself instead of through it. I did not know where it had come from. I had never asked. It seemed like such a small thing to have never asked, and yet sitting there, with the shape of a folded certificate still pressing against my chest through my jacket, it did not feel small at all. Every object in that kitchen had a story I could tell you without thinking. The cast-iron skillet from my grandmother, the carving board I'd built myself the summer after Meg was born. But the teapot had simply always been there, the way weather is always there, the way you stop noticing the specific shape of a thing you have looked at every single day of your adult life. "Where did you get that teapot?" I asked. Corinne turned around. There was something in her face for exactly 1 second, something that moved and then settled. The way water moves when a stone drops into it and then goes still again before you can name the shape it made. "You've asked me that before," she said. I had not. "Have I?" I said. "Years ago. You don't remember." She set 2 cups down on the counter, her hands steady, her voice easy, in a way that I had trusted my entire life, and was for the first time listening to, instead of simply hearing. "It was my mother's. I've told you that." I nodded. I did not say that I remembered every gift her mother had ever given her, every heirloom, every story attached to every object in this house, because Corinne had told me all of them over the decades. Told them to Meg. Told them to Meg's children when they visited. And I could not for the life of me recall the teapot ever being among them. Maybe I was wrong. That is what I told myself standing in my own kitchen at 5:30 in the evening. Maybe 55 years is long enough that a man forgets things, even things he thinks he would never forget, even the provenance of an object that sits on his stove every morning of his life. I did not ask again. This is the part I have thought about more than almost anything else since. I did not ask again. I took the cup she handed me, and I sat down at the table where I have sat down for supper more times than I could count if I gave my whole remaining life to counting. And I let the moment close over itself, the way water closes over a stone once it has finished sinking. We ate supper. She told me about a phone call from her sister in Charleston. I told her about a supplier who was raising prices on shrimp again, 3rd time this year, and how I was thinking about switching to the man out of Port Royal, even though his boats came in later. She laughed at the right places. I laughed at the right places. It was by every outward measure an ordinary Tuesday evening in a marriage that had survived 55 years of ordinary Tuesday evenings, and somewhere underneath the ordinariness of it I sat with a folded piece of paper against my chest, and a small crack running down the side of a teapot I had apparently asked about once before and forgotten the answer to. I decided clearing the plates that night that I was not going to say anything yet. Not about the certificate, not about the name in the margin. I told myself it was because I did not have enough to go on, that a faint pencil mark and a teapot I couldn't remember asking about were not evidence of anything that a man my age owed it to 55 years of marriage not to blow it apart over a feeling in his chest that might turn out to be nothing at all. That was the story I told myself. I have since had a great deal of time to consider whether it was the truth or whether it was simply the version of the truth that let me keep standing in my own kitchen for a little while longer, pretending the floor beneath it was as solid as it had always seemed. I washed the cups. I put them back exactly where they belonged. My father-in-law never once called me by my first name. 55 years into the day he died, I was the Pruitt boy to him, even after I owned the restaurant outright, even after I had cooked for 3 governors and a senator's daughter's wedding. I understood why, eventually. In 1970, my family had land and a name in Beaufort County, but the Delacroix name went back further, and further mattered more to a man like Corinne's father. "You'll do," he told me the night he agreed to the marriage. Not a blessing, an assessment, delivered the way you'd size up a length of lumber. Corinne did not say much of anything that night. I remember that now with a clarity I did not have at the time, because at the time I mistook her silence for shyness, for the kind of modesty a young woman was supposed to show about her own wedding. I was 26 years old, and desperate to prove I belonged in a family that measured worth in acreage and surname, and a desperate man sees what he needs to see. "She's a good match for you," my mother said the week before the wedding. "Quiet girl, steady." I did not ask my mother what she meant by steady. I have wondered since whether she meant something closer to guarded. The wedding was in June, at the Baptist Church on Carteret Street, and afterward there was a reception in a tent on the Delacroix property that cost more than I made in a year at the time. Corinne wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist. I wore a suit I'd borrowed from my uncle. Somewhere in the middle of that reception, her mother pulled me aside near the dessert table and pressed a small card into my hand. "Every anniversary," she said. "Make this for her." It was my mother's, and it will mean the world to Corinne more than you know. I looked at the card. Spice cake, the recipe read, in handwriting I did not recognize as anyone's in particular, because I had no reason yet to wonder whose handwriting it was. Cardamom, an orange peel, and a glaze made with bourbon, which struck me even then as an unusual combination for a Baptist family's cherished heirloom, though I was young enough to assume that unusual simply meant special. "I'll make it every year," I told her, and I meant it. The way young men mean the promises they don't yet understand the weight of. That night in the small rented house on Craven Street, where we would live for the first 6 years of our marriage, Corinne fell asleep before I did. I remember lying awake beside her, still half in disbelief that I had married into a name like Delacroix. Running through the evening in my mind, the way you replay something good to make sure it was real. Somewhere near 2 in the morning, she stirred, murmured something in her sleep, reached toward me the way a person reaches for someone in a dream. And she said a name. Not mine. It began with the sound of my own name's first letter, but did not finish there. De. And then something that dissolved into sleep before it became a full word. Before I could even be certain I had heard anything at all. I did not think much of it. I want to be honest about that sitting here now, with everything I know. A 26-year-old man, married 4 hours, lying in the dark beside a beautiful woman he could not quite believe had agreed to be his wife, that man does not go looking for reasons to doubt his good fortune. If anything, I told myself I had misheard. Wes, perhaps, my own cousin's name, someone she might have dreamed about, for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Or nothing at all. A sound with no letters attached to it, the kind of noise sleeping people make that only sounds like language if you are listening too hard. In the morning she woke and smiled at me, and said, "Good morning, husband," in a voice that carried no weight of anything unusual. And I decided the way a young man decides things, he wants to believe that I had imagined the whole of it. I made the cake that October for our first anniversary following her mother's card, exactly. It came out dense in the middle, the glaze pooling instead of setting. Corinne told me it was lovely. I could tell even then, even as inexperienced as I was in reading my new wife's face, that lovely was not the same as right. "It's not quite like your mother used to make," I said. "No," Corinne agreed. And there was something in the way she said it, something quiet and far away, that I filed under homesickness, under the ordinary grief of a young bride missing her family's table. "It's not quite like that." I did not ask her what it was quite like instead. I have thought about that question more times in the years since than I can count, the question I did not ask on the evening of my first wedding anniversary, standing in a kitchen that was not yet the one I would build my whole life inside of, holding a cake that had never once not that year, and not in the 54 years that followed, come out the way it was supposed to. My father taught me to cook the way his father had taught him, which is to say, he taught me almost nothing directly, and expected me to absorb everything by standing close enough to the stove to get burned occasionally. He ran a small diner on Bay Street before Bay Street became the kind of place tourists photographed, and I grew up in the back of it, the way some boys grow up in the back of a church. "Watch my hands," he'd say. "Don't watch the food, watch my hands." I did not understand what he meant until years later, standing in my own kitchen, teaching Meg the same way, watching her small fingers copy the exact motion of my wrist as I cracked an egg one-handed. By then I understood that a recipe was never really the words written on a card. It was the hands that made it, generation folding into generation, a language you could not write down even if you tried. I opened my own place in 1973, 2 years after the wedding, with money my father lent me and a small loan from a bank that only agreed to the terms because Corinne's father put his name on the paper as guarantor. I have never forgotten that. Whatever else was true, whatever I would come to learn decades later, I built Pruitt's with a debt to that family stitched into its foundation. And for the first 10 years of my marriage, I cooked like a man trying to pay off something larger than money. I wanted them to be proud they'd let their daughter marry a Pruitt. That wanting shaped nearly everything I did in those years. I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, chasing a version of respectability that I never once stopped to examine too closely. Corinne kept the books in the evenings, sitting at our kitchen table with a ledger and a cup of coffee gone cold beside her. And I remember thinking more than once that I had married a woman more capable than I deserved. She was good at the books. I want to say that plainly because it matters later, though I did not know yet how much it would matter. She caught errors the bank itself missed. She negotiated better terms with our first produce supplier than I ever could have on my own. I called her my secret weapon back then, and I meant it as the highest compliment I knew how to give. Meg was born in 1972, before the restaurant even opened, and I remember holding her in the hospital room, thinking that everything I was building for her as much as for myself. I did not know, holding that infant in a blue hospital blanket, that I was already 3 years into a marriage built on a foundation I had never once thought to test. Every October the 4th, I made the cake. I want to be honest and say that some years it improved marginally, the way any recipe improves with 1,000 repetitions, even when something essential remains wrong with it. By the 10th anniversary, it no longer collapsed in the middle. By the 20th, the glaze had stopped pooling, but it never once tasted the way Corinne's face told me it was supposed to taste, that flicker of something searching and not quite finding. Gone so fast most years I told myself I had imagined it. I asked her once, maybe our 15th anniversary, whether I was doing something wrong with the recipe. "You're doing everything right," she told me, and kissed my cheek, and I let the answer settle into me, the way I let most of her answers settle into me across those years, without turning them over to see what might be underneath. Sitting in my office decades later, the certificate folded against my chest. I found the recipe card itself in the bottom drawer where I kept it year-round, protected in a plastic sleeve because the ink had started to fade sometime in the 90s. I had read it so many times I could recite it without looking: cardamom, orange peel, a bourbon glaze that never fully set the way it should. My hand was not steady when I picked the card up that afternoon. I want to record that honestly because I have spent most of my life being a steady man. The kind of man other people in a busy kitchen learn to trust, precisely because his hands do not shake even under pressure. 40 years of pulling hot pans from an oven of boning fish, blindfolded by muscle memory of holding a knife an inch from my own fingers without flinching. But my hands shook then, holding a small rectangle of paper I had followed faithfully for 54 years. A paper I had once believed carried the weight of an entire family's history inside it. The card had softened at the corners from handling. I had traced my thumb along that same edge every October for half a century, the way a man rubs a coin smooth without noticing he's doing it. The handwriting was looping, old-fashioned, the kind of cursive nobody teaches anymore. I had never once in 54 years stopped to ask myself why a Delacroix family recipe would call for bourbon in a household that did not otherwise keep liquor in the house. Why the measurements were written in a hand that slanted left instead of right, the opposite of every other piece of Corinne's handwriting I had ever seen on a grocery list or a birthday card. Make this for her every year, her mother had told me at a reception under a white tent more than half a century ago. It will mean the world to her more than you know. I read those words differently now than I had read them for 54 years. More than you know. I had always heard those words as sentiment. Standing in my office with a stranger's name pressed against my chest, I heard them for the first time as something closer to a warning that I had simply never been equipped to recognize. The catering ledgers live in a filing cabinet in the storage room behind the walk-in. 4 drawers of green folders going back to 1984, when we first started doing wedding receptions and church banquets on top of the regular dining room business. Corinne had managed that side of the operation almost entirely on her own for as long as I could remember. I never asked to see the folders. I had never once in 40 years felt the need. I went back to the restaurant after Corinne had gone to bed, telling her I needed to check on a delivery that was supposed to come in early. It was not entirely a lie. I did have a delivery coming. I simply did not need to be there at 11 o'clock at night to receive it. The storage room smelled like it always did. Cardboard and bleach, and the particular mustiness of paper that has sat undisturbed for years. I pulled the earliest drawer first, not because I had a plan, but because a man who has spent his life following recipes in order tends to approach even his own unraveling in order. It took me almost 2 hours to find the first irregularity, and I want to say plainly that I am not a man trained to look for such things. I know food costs. I know supplier invoices the way I know the back of my own hand, because I have negotiated every one of them personally for 50 years, argued down every price increase, memorized every vendor's name and terms. What I found in Corinne's catering ledgers did not belong to any vendor I recognized. Coastal Provisions and Spice Trading Company. $400 paid in cash recorded every month without fail beginning in March of 1985. No invoice attached. No delivery receipt. No business license number in the margin where every other vendor entry carried one because Corinne had always been meticulous about that. Had always told me meticulous record-keeping was how a small business survived an audit. I sat on an overturned crate in that storage room and went through drawer after drawer, and the entry appeared again. And again. Some months it was $400. Other months, especially in the early years, it climbed to $600 or $700. I did the arithmetic in my head first, then on a scrap of receipt paper, because I did not trust my head to have gotten it right, and I did not want it to be right. Across 4 decades, the number I arrived at was close to $212,000. I sat with that figure for a long time in the quiet of the storage room, the refrigeration units humming through the wall behind me, and something loosened in my memory that I had not gone looking for. Our wedding night. The small rented house on Craven Street. Corinne's voice in the dark, half asleep, reaching toward me, and saying a name that began with the sound of my own name's first letter, and dissolved before it finished. I had told myself for 55 years that I had misheard. That it was nothing. That a young man newly married does not go looking for reasons to doubt the woman beside him. Sitting on that crate with a fabricated vendor's name in my hand. I did not tell myself that anymore. I found the address eventually buried in a single entry from 1991, the only year Corinne had apparently slipped and written more than the vendor's name. A street address, in a part of town I did not immediately recognize, out past the old rail yard, where a scattering of small rental properties had gone up sometime in the 70s and stayed mostly unremarked upon ever since. I copied the address onto the same scrap of receipt paper where I'd done my arithmetic, my handwriting unsteady enough that I had to write it twice before it was legible. I do not know how to describe what I felt sitting alone in that storage room past 1 in the morning, except to say that it was quieter than I expected grief to be. I had always imagined, if I imagined it at all, that a man finding out something like this would feel it as an explosion, a single unbearable moment. What I felt instead was more like watching a tide go out, slow, total, taking the shape of everything with it so that when it finally receded, there was no ground left underneath that looked the way it had before. I thought about waking Corinne when I got home. I stood in the hallway outside our bedroom door for what felt like a long time, listening to her breathe on the other side of it. The same slow rhythm I had fallen asleep beside for 55 years. I did not go in. I went instead to the kitchen, and I took the recipe card out of its plastic sleeve, and I sat at the table where I had eaten 10,000 suppers, and I looked at that looping, left-slanting handwriting until the sun came up over the marsh behind the house, turning the water the color of weak tea, the same color as the paper I had found folded in my office desk 2 days before. I did not cry. I want that on record, not out of pride, but because I think it matters to understanding the kind of man I was in that moment, still. I sat very still, and I cataloged the way I have cataloged every kitchen disaster of my working life, exactly what I now knew and exactly what I still did not. I knew there was a name, Calloway. I knew there was money, $212,000 of it, moving somewhere it had no business moving. I knew there was an address out past the rail yard that I intended to see with my own eyes before I said a single word to anyone. What I did not know sitting there as the light came up gray and then gold across the water was whether I had the courage to find out the rest. I did not drive out to the address that morning. I want to explain why, because it would have been the simplest thing in the world to get in my truck and see for myself what stood at the end of that street past the rail yard, and I did not do it. I told myself I needed to be certain first, that a man does not go knocking on a stranger's door over a pencil mark and a fabricated vendor's name, however much money had moved beneath it. That was the reason I gave myself. I have since come to believe the real reason was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of what I would find, and more afraid of what I would have to do once I found it. So instead I went looking for handwriting. It is a strange thing, trying to identify a stranger's hand, from a single pencil word, written small in the margin of a document older than your own children. I laid the birth certificate flat on my desk under the lamp and studied the letters one at a time. The C leaned forward sharply, almost aggressively, the kind of lean that comes from a person who writes fast and does not much care whether anyone reads it after them. The lowercase a's were open at the top, more like the letter U wearing a hat than a proper A. I have spent 50 years reading the handwriting of suppliers and delivery drivers and cooks scrawling orders on ticket pads in the middle of a Friday dinner rush, and something in the shape of those letters felt familiar to me in a way I could not immediately place. I went through every signature I could find in the restaurant's old files. Suppliers going back 3 decades. Former employees, dishwashers, and line cooks who had come and gone over the years. Their names on old tax forms filed away. Because I have never in my life thrown away a piece of paper I might one day need. None of them matched. Not the slant, not the open A's, not the particular way whoever had written that name in the margin had crossed the double L with a single confident stroke instead of 2 separate marks the way most people do. I want to tell you what finally struck me. Sitting at that desk past midnight for the second time in 3 days. Because it arrived the way most true things arrive in a working kitchen, not through reasoning, but through the body remembering something the mind had not caught up to yet. I have worked alongside cooks my entire life. I know how a man who spends his days writing ticket after ticket, order after order in the heat and rush of service, learns to write fast and small and legible only to himself. The hand that wrote Calloway in that margin was not a clerk's hand, careful and instructed. It was a cook's hand. Someone who wrote the way I write when I am jotting a prep list at 5 in the morning, with one eye still half closed, economical, quick-built for speed rather than beauty. I have seen that particular economy in 100 different hands over 50 years. Line cooks scribbling modifications on a ticket while a pan is already smoking behind them. My own father marking up his order pads at the diner on Bay Street, letters collapsing into each other the closer it got to noon. There is a rhythm to that kind of writing that has nothing to do with education or upbringing, and everything to do with a body trained to move faster than its own hand can properly follow. I turned the certificate under the lamp again, tilting it, and I could almost hear it, the particular clatter of a kitchen behind those letters, the way you can sometimes hear a man's voice in the shape of his signature if you have spent enough years reading tickets scrawled by people who never expected anyone to study them this closely. I sat with that recognition for a long time. It did not tell me a name. It told me something else, something that settled into my chest alongside the certificate I still carried folded there, that whoever this Calloway was, he had stood in a kitchen at some point in his life, the same way I had stood in mine for 55 years, learning to write his orders fast enough to keep up with the ticket rail. I thought of every cook I had ever known in Beaufort who might have crossed paths with Corinne in the years before I married her, or in the years just after, when she was still young enough that whatever history she carried might not yet have finished writing itself. I could think of no one. That did not comfort me. It only meant I did not yet know enough to think of the right name. I put the certificate away that night differently than I had the 2 nights before. I no longer felt like a man holding a mystery. I felt like a man holding the outline of a shape he did not yet have the full light to see. The way you can tell a fish is there, by the ripple it leaves on still water, without ever seeing the fish itself. I decided, sitting there with the desk lamp burning low, that I was done circling. I had spent 3 days gathering pieces of name and pencil, a teapot I could not account for, a ledger full of money moving toward nothing, a hand that wrote the way cooks write, and every piece pointed toward the same closed door. And behind that door was the only person who had ever had a key to any of it. I would ask her. Not through indirection, not through a careful question about a teapot dropped sideways into a supper conversation. I would put everything I had found on the table in front of her, the ledger and the certificate both, and I would ask her outright, and I would watch her face while she answered, because after 55 years of marriage, I still believed in that moment that I would be able to tell the difference between the truth and whatever she chose to give me instead. I did not know yet how wrong I was about that. I did not know that a woman who has kept a single secret successfully for over half a century has had more practice at controlling her face than I have had at reading it. However much I believed otherwise, however many decades I had spent across the table from her. Convinced I knew every expression she owned. I turned off the desk lamp a little after 2 in the morning. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow over supper I would ask. I waited until she had finished her plate. I want you to understand that this was deliberate, not kindness exactly, but something adjacent to it. 55 years of watching a woman eat her supper in peace before either of us brought up anything that might spoil the evening. Old habits do not dissolve simply because the ground beneath them has cracked. I set the ledger on the table between us, open to the page I had marked with a folded receipt. Beside it I laid the birth certificate, unfolded now for the first time since I had found it, the pencil name facing up toward the kitchen light. Corinne looked at both of them for a long moment before she looked at me. "What is this?" she said. Not a question quite. More like a woman testing the weight of a door before deciding whether to open it. "You tell me," I said. She picked up the ledger first, turned it toward herself, studied the entry I had circled in pencil. Coastal Provisions and Spice Trading Company. $400. Her face did something I had never seen it do before, not in 55 years of sitting across from her at 10,000 suppers. It did not fall. It settled. The way a house settles on an old foundation, small and internal and nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. And I was looking for it. "That's an old vendor," she said, "from years ago. I don't remember the details. For 40 years, I manage the catering accounts, Wendell, not you. There are vendors that come and go that you've never once had reason to think about. There's no license number, I said, no invoice, no delivery ever recorded. $212,000, Corinne, moving out of this business for 4 decades to a company I cannot find a single trace of anywhere else. Tell me what that is. She set the ledger down. Her hands, when she folded them on the table in front of her, were steady in a way that struck me even then as strange. Given everything, given the particular quality of stillness a person's hands take on when they are working very hard to appear unbothered. You've been going through my files, she said. I'd been going through the restaurant's files. They happen to be the same thing. That's not the same thing, and you know it isn't. I did not answer that. I let the silence sit there instead, the way I have let silences sit in 100 difficult kitchen conversations over the years. Because silence held long enough has a way of pulling the truth out of a person faster than a direct question ever does. It had worked on suppliers who padded invoices. It had worked on employees who broke something and hoped no one would notice. I had built a small private confidence over the decades in my own ability to wait a person out, to let the quiet do the work my questions could not. It did not work on Corinne. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes moving once around the kitchen, the stove, the window over the sink, the calendar still turned to September, though October had already begun, and then settling back on me, patient, almost serene, the way a person waits out a summer storm they know will pass on its own if given enough time. I understood, watching her wait me out in my own kitchen, that she had somewhere across the years I could not account for developed more practice sitting inside a silence than I had ever developed breaking one. There's a name, I said finally, when it became clear she was not going to fill the quiet on her own. I touched the edge of the certificate, turned it slightly so the pencil mark caught the light. Written in the margin of Meg's birth certificate. A name that isn't mine. Corinne's eyes went to the paper. Just for a moment. Just long enough that I saw something move behind them, something I could not yet name but would spend the rest of that year learning to recognize. It's an old document, she said. Clerks make mistakes. This isn't a clerk's handwriting, Corinne. I've spent 3 days confirming that. It's someone who wrote the way a cook writes, fast, economical. I know that hand because I've spent my whole life around men who write that way. She reached for her teacup. I watched her hand close around it, and I watched her knuckles go pale with how tightly she gripped the handle. Though her voice when she spoke gave away nothing of what her hand was doing. You're tired, she said. You've been up half the night with old ledgers and old paperwork, building something out of nothing. I think you should let this go. I don't want to let it go. I'm asking you to anyway. There was something in the way she said it, quiet and level, that felt less like a wife reassuring her husband and more like a woman closing a negotiation. I had heard that particular tone from her before, across a lifetime of watching her manage suppliers, vendors, difficult customers, anyone who threatened to complicate something she had already decided the shape of. I had simply never heard it turned toward me. I'm going to ask you something, I said, and I want you to look at me when I ask it. She looked at me. I will say that for her. Whatever else was happening behind her eyes in that moment, she did not look away. Is there someone? I said, and I felt the name rising in my throat before I had fully decided to say it. Named Desmond? The teacup did not shake in her hand. I want to be precise about that, because I have gone over this moment more times than I can count, and precision matters to me now in a way it did not used to. Her hand did not shake at all. It simply went still, entirely still, more still than a hand holding a warm cup of tea has any natural reason to be. And she looked at me across the table with an expression I had spent 55 years learning to read. And in that instant, found I could not read at all. Where did you hear that name? She said. You haven't answered me, I said. Where did you hear that name? I'm asking you first. Corinne set the teacup down carefully, the way she set everything down, as though the world itself required a certain deliberateness from her that other people were permitted to skip. She folded her hands again, and I noticed for the first time in that conversation that she had not once raised her voice, not once let anything in her tone crack. And I found myself thinking, absurdly, that I had spent 55 years admiring that particular steadiness in her without ever once wondering what it cost her to maintain it. "I found it," I said. "In your handwriting. In money that's been leaving this business for 40 years toward a company that doesn't exist. I want you to tell me who Desmond is." She did not answer right away. I watched something move across her face, quick and complicated, gone, before I could catalog it properly. And for a moment, I thought she might simply refuse, might sit there in silence until I gave up and left the table, the way I had left so many difficult conversations over the years, choosing peace over truth because peace was easier, and I had built a whole life on choosing the easier thing. "He was someone I knew," she said finally. "Before you." "Before me, yes. And you've kept paying him. For 40 years. Corinne looked at the table, at the ledger still open between us, and something in her posture changed. Some small collapse in the shoulders that I had never seen in her before. Not once, not in 55 years of watching her carry herself through every kind of difficulty a marriage and a business could produce. "It isn't what you think," she said. "Then tell me what it is." "I can't. Corinne, I said I can't." Her voice, for the first time, carried something sharp in it. Not anger exactly, but the particular defensiveness of a person cornered in a place they had spent decades making certain no one could corner them. "Not tonight. Not like this, with papers spread out on the table like you're building a case against me." "I'm not building a case. I'm asking my wife a question. You're doing both, and you know it." I did not know how to answer that, because some part of me understood, even in that moment, that she was not entirely wrong. I had laid the evidence out deliberately. I had chosen the ledger and the certificate and the careful order in which I presented them, the way I would plan a menu for a difficult table. And some part of that choice had been about control, about not letting this conversation slip away from me. The way I sensed, even before she said a word, that it wanted to slip. We sat like that for a while, neither of us speaking. The kitchen clock ticking through a silence that felt heavier than any silence I could remember. Sitting inside during 55 years of marriage, I watched her hands on the table. They had gone still again. That same unnatural stillness from before, and I understood watching them that whatever she was holding back was not going to come loose tonight, no matter how long I sat there waiting. "I need time," she said again, quieter now. "You've had 40 years. I know what I've had, Wendell." For a moment, something almost like grief crossed her face there, and gone so quickly I could not have sworn to it afterward. "I know exactly what I've had and what I haven't had better than you could possibly understand, sitting there with your ledger and your certificate deciding what kind of woman I am from a column of numbers." She stood up from the table. "Corinne, I need to think," she said. "I need you to give me that. After 40 years of not telling me you need more time." "Yes." She said it without apology, without the softening most people offer when they know a thing sounds worse spoken plainly than it did in their own head. "Yes, I do. And I am asking you for it anyway." I sat at the table after she left the room, listening to her footsteps on the stairs, the particular creak of the fourth step that had needed fixing for 20 years and that I had never gotten around to fixing. And I did not follow her. I want to explain why, because it would have been within my right to follow her up those stairs and demand she finish what she had started to say. I did not follow her, because some part of me, sitting alone at that table with the ledger and the certificate still spread out in front of me, had already begun assembling an answer I was not ready to hear confirmed out loud. A name in a margin. A recipe that never tasted right. A cook's handwriting. I am not a stupid man. Whatever else I may have been across 55 years of marriage. And the shape of what Corinne was not saying had already started quietly to resemble the shape of a daughter I had raised from her first breath and had never once, not for a single day of her life, thought question. I sat with that unfinished shape for a long time after the house went quiet. I did not go up to bed. I sat at the kitchen table until the light outside the window over the sink turned from black to the deep blue that comes an hour or so before real morning. And somewhere in that long stretch of stillness, I understood that whatever Corinne told me when she was finally ready to speak, some part of me had already stopped waiting to be surprised by it. Corinne did not come down for breakfast the next morning, and I did not go looking for her. I want to be honest that this was its own kind of cowardice, though at the time I told myself it was patience. I went to the restaurant instead, opened up as I had opened up nearly every morning for 50 years. And somewhere between the walk-in inventory and the first delivery truck, I decided where I would go once the lunch service ended. There is an old storefront on Bay Street 2 doors down from where my father's diner used to stand before it became a boutique selling scented candles to tourists. For most of my life, it had been a seafood market run by a family named Odom, and before that, in the years just after I married Corinne, it had briefly been something else. A small catering supply shop that sold spice blends and specialty flour to restaurants up and down the coast, back when Beaufort had fewer chain grocery stores and more of these particular niche operations that survived on relationships rather than volume. I remembered it because Corinne used to mention it in passing decades ago, before I had any reason to attach weight to the memory. A place she'd get certain spices you couldn't find anywhere else in town. The Odom family still lived above what was now the candle shop, and old Vera Odom, 86 years old and sharper than most people half her age, still sat on the porch most afternoons, watching Bay Street go by the way she had watched it for 60 years. I had known Vera my whole life. She had sold my father crab meat on credit more than once during lean winters, and she had never once in all that time forgotten a debt or a face. "Wendell Pruitt," she said when I climbed the porch steps. "Haven't seen you up here in years." "Been meaning to visit," I said, which was a lie, and I think she knew it, because Vera Odom had a way of looking at a person that made lying feel like a wasted effort. I did not know exactly how to ask what I had come to ask. I sat with her for a while first, talked about the weather, about her grandson's shrimp boat, about how the town had changed since we were both young enough not to notice it changing. Eventually, because there was no way around it, that did not feel more dishonest than simply asking, I said the name. "Do you remember a young man who used to work the old spice shop back in the early 70s? Name of Desmond." Something shifted in Vera's face, quick and knowing. The particular look of a woman who has lived long enough in one small town to have collected every secret worth keeping, and most that weren't. "Desmond Calloway," she said. And hearing the full name spoken aloud for the first time landed in my chest like a dropped plate. Now there's a name I haven't heard in 50 years. You remember him. Everybody remembered Desmond for a while. Talented boy. Could cook circles around men twice his age and knew it, which was half his trouble. Vera rocked slowly, her eyes somewhere out on the street, somewhere in a decade I hadn't been invited into. He came through here with some kind of fancy training from up north, worked the spice counter a season or two while he tried to get something of his own started. Never did, far as I know. Boy like that, all talent and no follow-through, tends to end up somewhere quieter than he started. Did you know him well? Well enough to know he had a taste for things that weren't his to have. She looked at me then directly, and I understood she was not only talking about spices. Your Corinne used to come round that shop some back before you two were married. Everybody knew it. I sat very still on that porch, the October afternoon light slanting low across Bay Street. And I did not trust myself to ask the next question out loud. Vera seemed to understand that too. She let the silence hold for a while, rocking, her hands folded in her lap, the way old women fold their hands when they've decided a thing has been said enough and doesn't need repeating. "It was a small town, then smaller than it is now," she said eventually, not quite looking at me. People noticed things, people talked, and then people got married, and the talking mostly stopped because that's what it does when a thing's been settled, one way or another, and there's no more use picking at it. "Did she love him?" I asked before I could stop myself, and hated the sound of my own voice. Asking it, an old man on a stranger's porch, asking a question he had no business asking anyone but his own wife. Vera did not answer that directly. She looked out at the street instead, at a pickup truck rolling slow past the candle shop. And when she finally spoke, her voice had gone softer than anything else she'd said that afternoon. "He made a cake once," she said unprompted, the way old women sometimes offer up exactly the thing you were too afraid to request. "For some occasion or another. Cardamom in it, orange peel, bourbon in the glaze, if I recall, which struck half this town as scandalous at the time, a Baptist bringing liquor into a dessert. He was proud of that cake. Talked about it for months after, like a man who'd invented something nobody else could ever get quite right. I felt the porch tilt slightly beneath me, though nothing had moved. "You all right, Wendell?" "I'm fine," I said, though I was not certain that was true. I thanked her for her time, and I walked back to my truck in a daze I did not fully surface from until I was halfway home. The shape I had been assembling all week finally closing into something whole, and unbearable, and entirely undeniably real. I drove home the long way, along the causeway, where the marsh grass had already started turning the color of old brass. And I did not turn on the radio, and I did not think about anything in particular, which is its own kind of thinking. The kind where the mind refuses to organize itself into sentences because the sentences it might form are too heavy to hold while operating a motor vehicle. Corinne's car was gone when I pulled into the driveway. I did not know where she had gone, and for the first time in 55 years of marriage, I did not immediately need to know. I let myself into the house and went straight to the kitchen to the drawer where I kept the recipe card in its plastic sleeve, and I laid it flat on the counter, under the good light over the stove. Cardamom. Orange peel. A bourbon glaze that never fully set. I read it the way you read something for the first time, even though I had read it more times than any other document I owned. Cardamom is not a spice that appears often in low-country baking. Not in 1970, not really now either. Not in the households I had grown up around or cooked for. It was the kind of ingredient a man might reach for if he'd trained somewhere else. Somewhere with a different palate, a young cook eager to distinguish himself from the plain vanilla and butter cakes every other mother in Beaufort was making for every other occasion. I thought about every October the 4th I had stood in this kitchen, following these exact measurements, and felt the particular failure of a man who believed the fault lived entirely in his own hands. Too dense one year, too dry the next. A glaze that pooled instead of setting, no matter how carefully I followed the instructions, because I understood this now, standing at the counter, with the card trembling slightly between my fingers, because the instructions themselves were incomplete. Someone had transcribed a recipe they had watched made, not one they had made 1,000 times themselves. There were gaps in it. A missing step in the way the butter should be creamed, some instinctive adjustment for humidity that a person only learns by doing a thing with their own hands over and over until their body knows what the page cannot say. Desmond had known those gaps. Desmond, wherever he was now, had carried that knowledge in his hands the way I carried the knowledge of my own grandmother's biscuit dough. An inheritance too specific and too physical to ever fully transfer onto paper. And I had spent 54 years trying to summon a competence that had never belonged to me in the first place, chasing a ghost's fingertips through a recipe written in another man's shorthand, blaming myself every single year for a gap I could not have closed, no matter how many times I tried. I do not know how long I stood at that counter. Long enough that the light through the kitchen window shifted from afternoon gold to the flatter gray that comes just before evening. I thought about throwing the card away. I want to be honest that the thought occurred to me, sharp and sudden, an impulse to open the drawer beneath the sink and bury it under coffee grounds and vegetable peelings, where it could not haunt another October. I did not do that. I stood there, instead turning the card over in my hands, and I thought about Meg, 8 years old, standing on a step stool beside me while I taught her to crack an egg one-handed, her face fierce with concentration, utterly certain that everything I was teaching her belonged to our family. To the two of us, to a lineage of hands reaching back further than either of us could properly account for. I thought about all the years since. Meg at 14 arguing with me over whether a roux should be blonde or dark for a particular gumbo, so certain of her own palate that she'd refused to back down even when I insisted she was wrong. and later tasting her version side by side with mine, admitting she'd been right all along. Meg at 30, standing beside me on the line during a Saturday dinner rush, moving through the kitchen with the same economical rhythm I'd spent a lifetime building into my own hands. A rhythm she had absorbed so completely I sometimes forgot watching her work that I was watching anyone other than a younger version of myself. Whatever blood ran in her, whatever name belonged in that margin, those hands were mine. I had built them, motion by motion, the same patient way my own father had built mine before me. Whatever this cake had been, whoever had first shaped its proportions in a spice shop on Bay Street half a century ago, I had made it every year of Meg's life. I had made it badly, imperfectly, chasing a ghost I did not know I was chasing. But I had made it, standing in this kitchen for her, for us, for the family I had built, whether or not it had started the way I always believed it had. October the 4th was 11 days away. I put the card back in its plastic sleeve and I set it on the counter, instead of returning it to the drawer where I would see it every morning between now and then. And I made a decision, standing there in the gathering dark, that I would turn over many times in the weeks that followed, questioning whether it had been wisdom or simply another form of the same old cowardice. I decided I was going to make the cake again this year. I did not yet know what I was going to do with everything else I had learned. But I was not, whatever else happened, going to let this particular tradition be the first thing I surrendered. Harmon Teal had done the restaurant's books for going on 15 years, ever since old Mr. Pemberton retired and sold his practice to a younger man who understood computers better than any of us did. Harmon was careful in a way I respected, meticulous about categories and reconciliations. And when I called him on a Thursday morning and asked if he could come by after close to look through some old catering ledgers with me, he did not ask why. That was one of the things I had always appreciated about Harmon. He did not ask why until you were ready to tell him. We sat in the back office with all 4 decades of green folders spread across the desk between us, and I told him plainly what I had found and what I suspected, and asked him to help me put a number to the whole of it, rather than the fragments I had already assembled on my own. It took him most of the evening. I sat across from him while he worked, watching him build a spreadsheet cell by cell, transferring 40 years of small cash payments into columns that made the whole pattern visible in a way the folders themselves had never quite allowed. It's not just the amounts, Harmon said somewhere around 9 o'clock, turning his laptop screen toward me. It's the timing. I did not understand what he meant until he pointed at the dates. Look here. March of 1985, first payment. That's close to your anniversary, isn't it? I had not told him our anniversary date. I felt something cold move through me as I did the arithmetic myself silently and confirmed that the March payment fell 9 days before the 4th of October did not track, but Harmon was already scrolling further, and I saw what he meant a moment later. October, he said. Every October without fail, going back to the beginning. Sometimes a few days before, sometimes the day itself. And look, he scrolled again, slower now, and I watched his face change slightly. The particular carefulness of a man realizing he was about to say something that would hurt the person sitting across from him. January 14th. Every year. Sometimes a smaller amount, but it's there every single year, without exception. January the 14th was Meg's birthday. I did not say anything for a long moment. Harmon did not fill the silence either, which I was grateful for because I do not think I could have absorbed anything else being said to me in that particular minute. Every year, I finally said, and my voice did not sound entirely like my own. Her birthday, my anniversary, for 40 years. It looks that way, Harmon said carefully. I don't want to speculate beyond the numbers, Wendell, but the pattern's there. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and it wasn't a one-time thing that just kept getting logged out of habit. Somebody was marking occasions. I sat with that word for a long time. Marking occasions. As though someone somewhere had kept a private calendar running alongside the one I shared with my own family, honoring the same dates I honored for reasons that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a life I had never known was running in parallel to mine. Total, I said. What's the total, all of it? Harmon turned the laptop fully toward me this time. The number at the bottom of the column was larger than the figure I had calculated on my own weeks before. Larger by nearly $40,000, because I had missed entries in years I had skimmed too quickly, and because Harmon had found a handful of transfers in the 90s that did not appear in the catering ledgers at all. Buried instead in a personal account statement Corinne had once, years ago, asked me to help her balance, and that I had never thought to question since. $251,000. There's something else, Harmon said, and I understood from his tone before he said another word that whatever came next was going to be worse than the number itself. I cross-referenced the dates against the restaurant's own event calendar just to see if anything lined up. There's a payment recorded 11 days ago. $400, same account pattern, same handwriting, as far as I can tell from the scan. 11 days ago. The week I had found the certificate. You're certain, I said. I'm certain of what the ledger shows. I can't tell you what it means. Harmon closed the laptop gently, the way a man closes something he does not want to be responsible for having opened. I'm sorry, Wendell. I wish I'd found something different. I sat alone in that office for a long time after he left. The green folders still spread across the desk. The number 251,000 sitting in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out into every year of my marriage I had ever believed was solid ground beneath my feet. I thought about every January the 14th I could remember. Meg's 5th birthday, a small party in the backyard with a cake shaped like a turtle because that was the animal she loved most that year. Her 16th, the year she'd wanted nothing but a new set of chef's knives, which I had given her, proud beyond measure that my daughter wanted tools instead of trinkets. Her 40th, a quiet dinner at the restaurant after close, just the three of us, Corinne laughing at something Meg said, easy and warm in a way that had never once, not for a single second across any of those celebrations, struck me as anything other than genuine. And I thought about every October the 4th. Every cake. Every year I had stood in this kitchen chasing a flavor that never arrived, blaming my own hands, while somewhere quietly a payment moved out of this business toward a man whose name I had not known until 11 days ago. On the same date I had spent half a century believing belonged only to Corinne and me. 40 years of dates I had thought belonged only to us, quietly shared all along with someone else. I drove out past the rail yard that same night, the address Harmon had confirmed still burning in my mind, alongside everything else he had shown me. I had told myself weeks ago, when I first found it scrawled in a ledger margin, that I would go see it with my own eyes before I said a word to anyone. I had said several words to several people since then. I went anyway. The street was quieter than I expected, a row of small rental houses built sometime in the 70s, the kind of modest single-story homes that had once housed shipyard workers and now mostly housed retirees, and the occasional young family priced out of the historic district closer to the water. Number 14 sat near the end of the block, a low white house with a carport instead of a garage, a single porch light burning against the early dark. I did not get out of the truck right away. I sat in the driver's seat for what felt like a long time watching that porch light, telling myself I had no plan, no intention beyond confirming that a place existed where an address in a ledger had promised one would be. A car pulled into the carport while I sat there. Not Corinne's car. A silver sedan I did not recognize, and a man got out of it, moving with the particular slowness of someone well into his 80s, favoring one hip as he made his way toward the front door. He was tall, or had been once, though age had folded some of that height back into itself. He wore a cardigan despite the mild evening, and he carried a small paper bag from the pharmacy in one hand. I did not need anyone to tell me who he was. I knew it the way I had known the shape of Calloway's handwriting before I could have named a single fact about the man who owned it. Not through evidence exactly, but through some older, more animal recognition that arrives before the mind has finished assembling its case. I thought watching him fumble with his cardigan pocket of every image I had ever formed of him without meaning to. A young man behind a spice counter, quick-handed, sure of himself in the way Vera Odom had described. A cook's hand crossing a double L in one confident stroke. Somewhere between that young man and the stooped figure struggling with his keys on a modest porch, an entire life had happened to him. A life that had run invisible to me, parallel to my own for 55 years. I found I could not summon any anger looking at him, not in that moment. Only a strange, unwelcome pity. And beneath the pity, something colder still. He paused on the porch, fumbling for his keys, and in the moment before he found them, the front door opened from the inside. I could not see who opened it. The porch light caught only a hand on the door frame, a sliver of movement and the gap gone before I could resolve it into anything certain. But I heard a voice carried faintly across the quiet street, on the kind of still evening air that travels sound further than it has any right to. A voice pitched low and warm in the particular register people use only with someone they have known long enough to stop performing for. I have spent 55 years learning the specific music of that voice. I did not need to hear the words to know whose voice it was. I sat in my truck at the end of that street until both the porch light and every light behind it had gone dark some 2 hours later. And I do not know exactly what I had expected to feel driving out there. Confirmation, perhaps. Some final, decisive proof that would let me close the question the way Harmon had closed his laptop, gently done with it. What I felt instead was the particular vertigo of a man discovering that a story he believed had ended decades ago had, in fact, never stopped being written. I had built an entire understanding of my marriage around the idea that whatever had happened between Corinne and this man belonged to a sealed chapter, painful perhaps, but finished. The kind of old wound a person carries without it continuing to bleed. Watching that porch light, listening to a voice I had trusted my whole life carry itself across a quiet street toward a man who was not me, I understood that I had been wrong about the most basic shape of it. This was not a chapter. It had never closed. Whatever this was, whatever name belonged to it, it had been running alongside my entire marriage, the way a river runs alongside a road, sometimes near enough to hear, sometimes far enough to forget, but never once in 55 years actually drying up. She never stopped. Not once. Not for 50 years. I drove home slowly, the causeway dark on either side, the marsh invisible except where my headlights caught the white flash of a heron. Startled up from the reeds, I thought about every ordinary evening Corinne had ever come home a little late. Every unremarkable errand she had mentioned in passing over supper, every small gap in an account of her day that I had never once thought to question. Because a man married 55 years does not audit his wife's afternoons. I wondered how many of those gaps had led here, to this quiet street, to that porch light. I did not know, and I understood somewhere on that dark road that I might never know the full number, and that not knowing was its own particular kind of weight I would now be carrying for however many years I had left. Somewhere on that drive, I stopped being a man gathering evidence and became instead a man trying to figure out what kind of life he had actually been living, and whether any part of it had ever belonged to him the way he had always believed it did. Meg found me in the walk-in the next morning, longer than necessary, in front of the shrimp delivery, doing inventory I had already done twice. "You've counted that box 3 times, she said, leaning against the doorframe. "I've been watching, making sure the count's right. Dad." She said it the way she'd said it since she was small. 2 syllables that could mean 100 different things, depending on the weight she put behind them. This time it meant she wasn't buying what I was selling. "You've run this kitchen for 50 years. You don't need to count a box of shrimp 3 times. I set the box down and closed the walk-in door behind us as we stepped out into the kitchen proper, where the morning prep was already underway. A line cook working through a mountain of okra at the far counter, someone else breaking down a case of tomatoes. The ordinary music of a restaurant coming to life around us, and I stood inside it, feeling like a man wearing a disguise of his own life. "Everything's fine," I said. "You've said that 4 times this week." It wasn't true the first time either. I did not answer right away. Meg had always had her mother's patience for silence, though I had never until recently thought to wonder where that particular trait had actually come from. "Your mother and I are working through something," I said finally, which was true in the way a person tells the truth when they are still deciding how much of it they are willing to hand over. "It's between us. It doesn't need to concern you. It concerns me when you can't look either of us in the eye at supper." She crossed her arms, and I saw not for the first time how much of my own posture lived in her, the particular way she planted her feet when she wasn't going to be moved. "Mom's barely eating. You're counting shrimp boxes 3 times. Something's wrong, and I'm 54 years old, not 8. You don't have to protect me from whatever it is." I looked at her, then really looked the way I had not quite let myself look at her since the afternoon I found that certificate. Her hands, restless at her sides, moved the exact way mine did when I was working through a problem I hadn't solved yet. A habit I had taught her without ever once meaning to teach it, simply by being the man she watched every day of her childhood. Her eyes, though, her eyes had never been mine, and I had never once, across 54 years, thought to wonder whose they were. Brown, going almost amber at the center. A color I could not place anywhere in my own family or in any photograph I had ever seen of the Pruitts going back 3 generations. I had always told myself, when I thought about it at all, that eye color was simply one of those unaccountable things a family produces sometimes. A grandmother's coloring surfacing 2 generations later. Nothing more mysterious than genetics doing what genetics does. Standing in that kitchen now, watching those amber-brown eyes study my face for whatever truth I was withholding, I understood I had been telling myself a comfortable lie for over half a century. The same way I had told myself a comfortable lie about a recipe card and a teapot and 100 other small unexamined things that had all along been pointing toward the same answer. "It's a business matter," I said. "Some old accounts I'm sorting through. Nothing that concerns you directly." She did not believe me. I could see that clearly enough in the way her mouth tightened a small motion, the kind you'd miss if you hadn't spent her entire life learning the specific grammar of her face. "Do you remember?" she said after a moment, her voice softer now, dropping the interrogation. "When you taught me to crack an egg one-handed? I must have been 7, maybe 8. "I remember. You made me practice for a week. Wouldn't let me use 2 hands even when I begged you. Said a real cook doesn't need 2 hands for something that simple." "You were terrible at it for the first 3 days. "I was terrible at it for the first 3 days, she agreed, and something in her face softened further, some old warmth surfacing despite the tension still sitting between us. "And then I wasn't. And you told me, I remember this exactly, you told me that was the whole secret to everything worth learning. That you fail at it badly enough times that your hands finally get tired of failing, and then one day, they just don't anymore." I did not trust my voice enough to answer that. "Whatever this is," Meg said, watching me with an expression I could not entirely name. Something between worry and a kind of fierce, protective love that had been hers to give since the day I first held her. "You can tell me. Whenever you're ready. I'm not going anywhere." I nodded, because it was the only response available to me that would not break something open in front of the whole morning kitchen crew, and I turned back toward the walk-in before she could see what was happening behind my eyes, before the weight of everything I was not saying pressed itself all the way to the surface. Behind me, I heard her go back to the line, calling out something to the cook working the okra, her voice steady and warm, and utterly unaware of how close I had just come to telling her everything. I kept the cedar box in the small office off the back hallway, the one that had belonged to my father, before it belonged to me. The wood gone dark and smooth with age in the places hands had touched it most often. It had held recipe cards once, decades ago, before I moved the family ones into plastic sleeves for safekeeping. Now it held what I had gathered. The ledger pages Harmon had printed, the certificate, a folded sheet where I had written in my own hand every date and figure I intended to hold on to until I understood what I was going to do with any of it. I was adding to it that evening a printout of the property records for the house past the rail yard when I heard the office door creak on its hinge behind me. I closed the lid faster than I meant to. I want to be honest about that because the speed of it told its own story, the kind of speed a man's hands produce before his mind has finished deciding to be ashamed of something. The latch caught with a small, definite click, louder in that quiet office than it had any business being. Meg stood in the doorway. I do not know how long she had been standing there before the creak announced her, whether she had seen the papers themselves or only the motion of my hands closing around them, guilty and quick. The posture of a man hiding something rather than simply putting something away. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't." A lie and a poor one, delivered in a voice that had gone tighter than I intended. She looked at the box. Just for a moment her eyes moved from my face to the cedar lid and back again, and I watched her take in whatever she could read from the two of us standing there. Me with my hand still resting flat against the closed lid, as though I could hold it shut through will alone. "What's in there?" she asked. Not sharp. Careful the way a person asks a question they are not certain they want answered. "Old paperwork," I said. "Restaurant business. Nothing that concerns you." I watched something settle in her face. Not belief exactly, but a kind of weary resignation. The look of a person who has asked the same door to open several times now, and has decided, for the moment, not to keep knocking. "Okay," she said, though her voice made clear it was not, in fact, okay. Only that she was choosing for tonight to let it stand. "I was just looking for you. Supper's ready." "I'll be right there." She lingered a moment longer in the doorway. I could see her weighing whether to say something else, some version of the same question she had asked me in the kitchen days before. Whether this was the moment to push harder or the moment to retreat. She chose to retreat. I have thought since about what might have happened if she had chosen differently, if she had crossed the room and put her hand on the box the way I had put mine on it and demanded I open it in front of her. "Whatever it is, Dad," she said instead, quiet from the doorway. "You can tell me." I did not answer. I could not have trusted my voice to hold steady if I had tried. And some part of me understood that whatever I said in that moment, badly, unsteadily, would tell her more than my silence would. So I let the silence stand, and after a moment she turned and went back down the hallway toward the kitchen. Her footsteps soft on the old pine floor, and I heard the particular creak of the third board from the end, the one that had needed fixing for as long as this house had been ours. I sat alone in the office for a while, after she left longer than I meant to. The house going quiet around me, in that particular way old houses do, once the ordinary business of supper has settled into the walls. The lamp on the desk threw a small circle of yellow light across the closed lid of the cedar box, and beyond that circle, the room sat mostly in shadow, the way it had sat every evening for 40 years. Unremarkable, ordinary, holding nothing anyone had ever needed to hide before. I thought about the years this box had spent open on a shelf unlocked, unremarkable, holding nothing more secret than birthday cards and old photographs, and the occasional receipt I meant to file away properly and never did. I could not now remember exactly when I had started closing the lid, whether it had been a single decision or simply a habit that had crept in alongside everything else these past 2 weeks, the way a man learns to lock a door in a neighborhood that has only recently started to feel unsafe. I did not like what it told me about myself that I had become, in the space of a fortnight, a man who kept things from his own daughter in his own house. Somewhere down the hall I could hear the low clatter of plates being set on the table, water running, the ordinary sounds of a house settling into supper. I sat and listened to it for a long moment without moving my hand, still resting on the closed lid, feeling the faint grain of the wood beneath my palm. Cool and familiar, and giving nothing away. The 50th anniversary of Pruitt's fell on the second Saturday in November, and the planning for it had been underway for the better part of a year before any of this began. Long before I had ever laid eyes on a name written small in a margin. Meg had organized most of it herself, tracking down old regulars, printing invitations, arranging for a local paper to run a piece on the restaurant's history. It had been until 3 weeks ago the thing I looked forward to most in that entire season, a chance to stand in the dining room I had built with my own hands and see half a century of my life gathered under one roof, every table and chair and framed photograph. A small monument to a story I had believed until recently I understood completely. Now I looked at the date circled on the kitchen calendar and understood it had become something else entirely. I remember standing in the dining room one afternoon that week, watching Meg tape a banner along the far wall, half-finished sentences from the printed history she'd written for the occasion, visible where the paper caught the light. 50 years of Pruitt family cooking, it read in her careful hand. I stood there a long moment reading those words, feeling the particular vertigo of a man watching his own history be written down in ink that might not in the end be entirely accurate. I spent those days moving between two versions of myself. The man greeting suppliers and approving menu proofs for the anniversary dinner, and the man who sat alone in the office at night, adding to the cedar box, building a case I still did not fully understand my own intentions toward. I had considered more than once simply confronting Corinne again, forcing the conversation to its conclusion in the privacy of our own kitchen. I had considered saying nothing at all, letting the anniversary pass, letting whatever remained of my marriage limp forward on the same comfortable silence that had carried it for 55 years. Neither option sat right with me. The first felt like it would only produce another version of the conversation we'd already had circling the same closed door without ever forcing it open. The second felt like the choice of a man who had already decided he was too old, too tired, too far along in his own life to demand anything better of it. And whatever else I was in that season, I found I was not ready to be that man either. I thought about what Harmon had said, closing his laptop that night. I can't tell you what it means. I had spent 3 weeks trying to answer that question on my own, turning it over at 2 in the morning, at the stove during the lunch rush, on the long drive home from Vera Odom's porch. What did it mean? All of it. The money, the dates, the man in the cardigan, on a quiet street past the rail yard. A daughter with amber eyes I had loved without reservation for 54 years, regardless of whose blood ran in her. I did not want revenge. I want that stated plainly because I have turned this question over enough times to be certain of it. I did not want to humiliate Corinne, not truly, whatever anger sat coiled beneath my ribs on the nights I could not sleep. What I wanted, I came to understand somewhere in that second week, was simpler and harder than revenge. I wanted the truth spoken out loud, once in a room large enough that it could not be quietly folded back into a marriage's private silences, the way every other difficult thing between us had always eventually been folded. The anniversary dinner would fill the dining room with nearly everyone who mattered to this family. Meg would be there. Old friends, longtime regulars, the mayor, the local paper's reporter. Corinne, of course, seated where she had always been seated, at every occasion this restaurant had ever hosted, beside me at the head table, performing the particular grace she had performed at 10,000 suppers before this one. I began that week to think of the anniversary not as something to survive, but as something I might use. I did not yet know exactly what that meant. I turned the idea over the way I turn over a difficult dish, testing it from different angles, discarding versions that felt too cruel or too cowardly in equal measure. I only knew that I was tired, bone tired of being the last person in every room to understand the shape of my own life, and that whatever happened at that dinner, I intended to walk into it, no longer willing to be that man. I added one more item to the cedar box that week. A printed itinerary of the evening's program, the toast, the speeches, the moment near the end when I was scheduled, as I was every year, to say a few words about the restaurant's history before the cake was cut. I circled that moment on the page, my pencil pressing hard enough to leave an impression on the sheet beneath it. I did not yet know what I would say when I reached it. I only knew, closing the lid that night, that I finally had somewhere to stand when I said it. The night before the anniversary, I could not sleep, and I did not try very hard to. I lay in the dark beside Corinne, listening to her breathing settle into the slow rhythm of real sleep. And I thought about forgiveness, a word I had not examined closely in 55 years of a marriage that had, until 3 weeks ago, never required much of it. I have heard forgiveness preached about my entire life in the church on Carteret Street, where I was married in the particular way my mother used the word when she wanted a grudge to end faster than it wanted to end on its own. I had always understood it in some vague way I never troubled myself to make precise, as a kind of release. You forgave a person and the weight you'd been carrying about them simply lifted, and the two of you continued forward lighter than before. Lying awake that night, I understood I had never actually forgiven anyone of anything that mattered. I had absorbed small grievances my whole life, the way I absorbed everything else, quietly, without complaint, calling the absorption itself a kind of grace. That was not forgiveness. I saw that clearly now, in the dark, with my wife breathing evenly beside me, and a stranger's whole life folded into a cedar box down the hall. Forgiveness required knowing precisely what you were forgiving. I did not know that yet. I had pieces of name, a sum of money, a porch light going dark on a quiet street. But I did not have the whole shape of it, and I was not certain a man could offer real forgiveness for a shape he had not yet fully seen. I thought of my own father, dead now, 20 years, who had never once in my hearing used the word forgiveness without following it with a story about weakness, about people who let themselves be walked over because standing firm felt harder than folding. I had absorbed that lesson too. Somewhere in the same years I absorbed everything else he taught me about running a kitchen. And I wondered now, lying in the dark, whether the two lessons had ever actually belonged together, or whether I had simply assumed they did because they arrived from the same voice in the same room at the same formative age. I thought about what it would mean to walk into that dinner tomorrow. Already decided, already softened toward whatever Corinne might say once the truth was finally spoken aloud in front of everyone we knew. I thought, too, about what it would mean to walk in hardened, armored, determined to make her suffer for every quiet October I had spent chasing a flavor that was never mine to find. Neither felt honest. I did not know lying there which version of myself I would be by the time I reached the moment I had circled on that program. And I decided somewhere near 3 in the morning that this uncertainty was not a failure of preparation, but simply the truth of the thing. A man does not know how he will stand in a doorway until he is standing in it. What I did know, turning the question over one final time before sleep finally took me, was how I wanted to do it. Whatever it turned out to mean once I was standing at that podium with the whole room watching. Not cruelty, I was certain of that much. Whatever Corinne had done, however many years she had spent quietly betraying the shape of the life I believed we were building together, I did not want to be the man who used a public stage to humiliate a woman I had loved, however imperfectly, however incompletely, for 55 years. I thought of Meg standing in the doorway of my office a few nights before. "Whatever it is, Dad, you can tell me." I had not answered her then. I understood, lying awake that final night, that tomorrow I would not have the option of silence anymore. Not once I stood up in front of that room, not once I said whatever I was going to say. Whatever this was going to cost, it was going to cost Meg too. And I owed her, if nothing else, the version of the truth that did not turn her mother into a spectacle for the whole town's entertainment. I thought about how she would hear it, whatever words I finally chose. Not as a stranger in that room would hear it, curious, entertained, a piece of gossip to carry home and repeat over coffee the following week. Meg would hear it as the ground shifting beneath the only family she had ever known. And I understood that whatever satisfaction I might feel standing up there finally unburdened of a secret I had carried for 3 weeks, that satisfaction would cost her something I could not measure in advance and could not, however careful I was with my words, entirely protect her from. Gentle. I decided on that word somewhere in the last hour before dawn, turning it over the way I had turned over every difficult recipe of my working life, looking for the version that honored the ingredients without pretending they were something other than what they were. Gentle and honest and entirely finally done with silence. Not a performance of forgiveness I did not yet feel, and not a performance of anger either, but something plainer than both. The simple, unadorned act of finally saying a true thing out loud in a room large enough that it could never again be folded quietly back into the dark. I fell asleep a little before the sky began to lighten, and when I woke a few hours later, Corinne was already downstairs, and the kitchen smelled like coffee. And for one disorienting moment before memory caught up with me, the morning felt almost like any other morning of the 55 years that had come before it. I went into the restaurant kitchen alone that morning, hours before anyone else would arrive to start prepping for the evening's dinner. I told Corinne I had some early orders to check on. That was not entirely a lie, though it was not entirely the truth either. And I had grown weary these past weeks of measuring exactly how much of either I owed anyone. I took the recipe card out of its plastic sleeve one last time and laid it on the steel counter under the kitchen lights. And then, for the first time in 54 years, I did not follow it. I want to explain what I mean by that because it was not defiance exactly. Not the dramatic gesture it might sound like, described plainly. I simply began instead from what I actually knew, cardamom. Yes, I kept that because, whatever its origins, I had come to genuinely love the particular warmth it brought to a cake, the way it sat underneath the sweetness rather than announcing itself the way cinnamon always did. But I adjusted the ratio, cutting it by a third, the way my own instincts told me it wanted to be cut, instincts built over 50 years of standing at this exact counter, learning what my own palate actually preferred, rather than what someone else's handwriting had once instructed. I changed the orange peel to blood orange because we'd started getting a beautiful crop of them from a supplier out of Florida 2 winters back, and I had always thought, tasting them, that their particular sharpness would suit this cake better than the standard navel oranges the original recipe called for. I had never once in 54 years allowed myself that small deviation. I allowed it now. The bourbon I kept. Not out of sentiment for whoever had first thought to add it, but because I had, across 5 decades of testing and failing and testing again, come to believe the bourbon glaze was genuinely the right choice for this particular cake, regardless of who first arrived at it. A good idea does not stop being a good idea because of who had it first. I had learned that principle from every kitchen I had ever worked in, and I saw no reason to abandon it now simply because the person who'd first had this particular idea had also, without my knowledge, spent 40 years quietly dismantling my marriage. I creamed the butter longer than the card instructed, trusting my own hands instead of someone else's shorthand feeling for the exact moment the mixture turned pale and light, rather than counting to some arbitrary number of minutes. I folded in the dry ingredients the way I had taught Meg to fold them, gently, in broad, unhurried strokes, refusing to rush, even though some old anxious part of me wanted to hurry through the whole process before anyone could walk in and ask what I was doing. I baked it slower than the card instructed, at a lower temperature, the way I had come to understand across thousands of cakes over the decades actually produced the density I wanted, rather than the density the original recipe assumed a home baker's oven would produce. When it finally came out 40 minutes later, the kitchen filled with a smell I had never once in 54 Octobers smelled coming from my own oven. Warmer somehow. Rounder. I let it cool exactly as long as it needed to cool, resisting the old urge to rush the glaze on too early. And when I finally cut a small corner and tasted it standing alone in that quiet kitchen, with the morning light just beginning to come through the high windows, I understood immediately, without any doubt at all, that I had finally made it correctly. Not Corinne's mother's cake. Not Desmond's cake, whatever claim his hands might once have had to its proportions. Mine. Built from 50 years of my own accumulated instinct, adjusted by my own accumulated taste, standing entirely on ground that belonged to no one but me. I stood there a long moment, the taste still on my tongue. And I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 3 weeks. Tight perhaps for 54 years, without my ever once noticing the tightness. I was not free of anything yet. I understood that clearly enough, wiping the counter down, washing the single fork I'd used to taste it. But I had, for the first time since I had found that certificate, folded in a manila envelope, done something that belonged entirely to me, made with my own 2 hands, answering to no one's memory but my own. I thought, standing there in the quiet, about all the versions of this cake I had made across 5 decades. Every dense middle, every pooled glaze, every small private failure I had carried home in my chest each October, convinced the fault lived somewhere in my own inadequate hands. I understood now that I had not failed at making someone else's cake correctly. I had simply never been given the whole recipe, only a fragment of it, transcribed by a woman who had watched it made rather than made it herself, and I had spent half a century blaming my own competence for a gap that had never once been mine to close. There was a strange grief in that realization sitting alongside the relief. 54 years of quiet self-doubt, and none of it in the end had ever actually belonged to me. I wrapped the cake carefully and set it in the walk-in to rest until evening. Tonight, I told myself, closing the heavy door behind it, I would stand in front of everyone I loved and finally tell the truth. But first, for once in 54 years I had gotten the cake right, on my own terms, and that felt, standing alone in that quiet kitchen, like the truer beginning of everything that was still to come. The dining room filled faster than I expected. By 7 o'clock, every table was seated, white cloth and candlelight, the banner Meg had taped up that week, hanging above the fireplace where I could see it from nearly anywhere in the room. 50 years of Pruitt family cooking. I had stopped twice already that evening to read it again, and both times I had felt the same quiet vertigo I'd felt the first time. I moved through the room before dinner service began, shaking hands, accepting the particular warmth a small town offers a man it has watched succeed across half a century. Old Mrs. Kittredge, who had eaten Sunday supper at our restaurant every week since it opened, gripped my hand in both of hers and told me I looked exactly the same as the day we'd opened, which was kind of her and entirely untrue. The mayor's wife asked after Meg's Paris trip. Vera Odom's grandson, grown now, told me his grandmother had mentioned running into me a few weeks back. And I had smiled and said something non-committal and moved on before the conversation could go anywhere I wasn't ready for it to go. Corinne sat beside me at the head table, in a dress the particular shade of blue she had always favored for occasions like this. Her hair done, her smile steady and warm, and entirely convincing to anyone who had not spent the last 3 weeks learning to see past it. I had not told her what I planned to do that evening. I had considered it more than once, standing in the office with the cedar box open in front of me. And I had decided against it, not out of cruelty, but because I understood finally that a warning would only give her time to prepare a version of the truth, rather than deliver the actual one. Meg sat across from us, radiant in a way that made my chest ache to look at. Greeting old family friends, accepting compliments on the decorations, entirely unaware of how much the room around her was about to change. The mayor spoke, first, brief and warm, about what Pruitts had meant to the town across 5 decades. The reporter from the paper took notes. I sat through it with my hands folded on the white tablecloth, feeling the particular calm that sometimes arrives before a difficult service. The stillness a man finds once every decision has already been made, and all that remains is the execution of it. When it came my turn, I stood and the room quieted, the way rooms quiet for a man who has earned across 50 years the right to be listened to. "Thank you all for being here," I began, and my voice, to my own surprise, came out steady. 50 years is a long time to stand in one kitchen. Long enough that you start to understand certain things about cooking that you didn't understand at the start. A few soft laughs moved through the room. I let them settle before continuing. When I was young, I inherited a recipe. A cake, actually. Some of you have had it, at one anniversary dinner or another over the years. I was told it came from my wife's family, passed down, a treasure I was meant to guard and honor exactly as it had been given to me. I paused and I felt Corinne go very still beside me, though I did not look at her directly. For 54 years, I made that cake exactly the way I was taught, and for 54 years, it never once came out quite right. I blamed my hands. I blamed my training. I never once thought to question whether the recipe itself was the thing I'd been given incompletely. I could feel the room's attention sharpen slightly. The particular hush that gathers when people sense a speech turning into something they had not expected. "A kitchen teaches you patience if it teaches you nothing else," I continued. "It teaches you that the things worth having take time to understand properly, sometimes decades. Sometimes you don't understand a thing at all until you're standing at the very end of your patience and the truth of it finally arrives, whether you're ready for it or not." I glanced briefly toward the back of the room, where I had asked Harmon to stand near the door, with the folder I'd given him that morning, in case the evening required it. He caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. "This year," I said, turning back to the room, my voice dropping into something quieter, something that pulled every remaining conversation in the room to a full stop. I finally made that cake correctly. Not by following the old recipe more carefully, by setting it down and building something honest in its place. Out of everything I've actually learned in 50 years of standing at that stove, I looked finally at Corinne. Her face had gone the particular pale I remembered from the night I first laid the ledger on our kitchen table. And I understood, watching her, that some part of her already knew exactly where this speech was going. I want to tell you all a little about where that old recipe actually came from, I said, and the room, entirely silent now, waited for me to continue. Forks stilled halfway to plates, the particular hush of a whole room leaning forward at once. 55 years ago, at my own wedding reception, my mother-in-law gave me a recipe card and told me it had been in her family for generations. I believed her. I had no reason not to. I paused, and the room stayed utterly silent. The kind of silence 100 people produce together when they sense they are watching something they were not meant to see and cannot look away from anyway. 3 weeks ago, I learned that recipe belonged to a man named Desmond Calloway, a young cook who worked the old spice shop on Bay Street back before most of you were regulars here. A man my wife knew before she knew me. A murmur moved through the room, quick and low, gone almost as soon as it started when they saw I was not finished. I watched Mrs. Kittredge's hand fly to her mouth, watched the reporter from the paper set down her pen, entirely forgetting for the moment that this was the story she had come to write. I want to be clear about something, I said, and I turned finally fully toward Corinne, who sat very still beside me, her hands folded in her lap in that particular stillness I had come to recognize as the shape of her holding herself together. This isn't about humiliating anyone tonight. I've thought about that a great deal these past 3 weeks, and I've decided it's not what I want, whatever else is true. But I've spent 54 years believing certain things about my own life that turned out not to be entirely accurate. And I think after 55 years of marriage, I've earned the right to say that out loud in front of the people who matter to us both. Wendell? Corinne's voice when it came was barely above a whisper, though the room was so quiet it carried anyway. Please. I found a name, I said. Not unkindly, but not stopping either. Written in the margin of Meg's birth certificate. I found 40 years of payments to a company that never existed. I found the man himself, Corinne, at a house past the rail yard 3 weeks ago, and I heard your voice on the other side of his door. The silence that followed that sentence was different from every silence that had come before it in that room. I watched it land on Meg's face first, watched something shift and crumble and reassemble itself in the space of a single breath, watched her eyes move from me to her mother and back again, searching for a denial that was not coming. Corinne stood. I do not know if she meant to leave the room or simply meant to stand to meet what was happening from a different position than sitting, but she stood, and the whole room watched her do it. And when she spoke, her voice had lost the whisper and found something harder underneath it. You want the truth? She said, looking at me, though I understood, watching her, that she was speaking to the whole room now, to Meg most of all. Fine. Yes. Desmond and I were together before I married Wendell. My family wouldn't allow it. He came from nothing, and Wendell's family had land and a name, and I did what I was told, the way girls did what they were told in this town in 1970. She stopped, her hands gripping the edge of the table, and for a moment I thought she might sit back down, retreat into the same careful stillness that had carried her through 3 weeks of my questions. Instead, she straightened, and her eyes moved to Meg, and something in her face broke open finally, after 54 years of careful performance. And yes, Desmond is your father, Meg. I am so sorry. I have been sorry every single day for 54 years, and it has never once been enough, and I don't expect it to be enough tonight either. Meg did not speak. I watched her instead, standing very still at her place at the table, one hand gripping the back of her chair hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. And I saw something cross her face that I recognized instantly, because I had felt it myself 3 weeks before, standing in my office with a certificate in my hand. I saw her remember in that exact moment, a night not long ago, when she had found me closing the lid of a cedar box too quickly. Guilty and quick, and had asked me what was inside, and I had lied to her. "Whatever it is, Dad," she had said. "You can tell me." I watched her understand, standing in that silent dining room with every person in Beaufort she had ever known watching her absorb it that I already had known, and had chosen for 3 weeks to carry it alone rather than hand her even a fraction of the weight before I was ready to hand her all of it. I watched that understanding land differently than the rest of it, not anger at her mother, not yet, but something quieter and closer to home. A private hurt aimed at me, the man who had watched her ask twice and answered twice with a lie. The room around us had gone so still I could hear the candle flames on the tables, a small, restless sound I had never once noticed in 50 years of hosting events in that dining room. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped against the floor, someone shifting, uncomfortable, unwilling to be the one who broke the silence first. No one spoke. No one reached for a water glass or a fork. 100 people sat frozen around white tablecloths, watching a family come apart in real time, and not one of them in that long, unbearable stretch of quiet looked away. She looked at me. She looked at her mother. And she said nothing at all. The dinner did not continue after that. Not in any real sense. People began leaving quietly within the hour, murmuring their thanks at the door, unwilling to meet my eyes directly, the way you avoid the eyes of someone who has just shown you more of themselves than you were prepared to see. The mayor left early. The reporter lingered longer than the rest, though she had the decency not to ask any questions on her way out, only offering a small nod that I understood correctly as a promise that whatever she wrote would be handled with more care than the moment itself had allowed. Harmon found me near the kitchen doors as the last few guests filtered out. The folder I had given him that morning still tucked under his arm, unopened, unused in the end. "You didn't need it," he said quietly. "You had it handled before I ever got here. I don't know that I'd call it handled. You told the truth in a room full of people who love you. That's more than most men manage in a lifetime." He squeezed my shoulder once briefly and let himself out into the cool November night. And I stood there a moment longer, watching the door swing shut behind him, feeling the particular hollowness that follows any difficult service once the last ticket has finally cleared the rail. Corinne left before the last of the guests had gone. I did not stop her. I watched her cross the emptying dining room, her blue dress catching the candlelight one final time. Her back straight in a way that struck me even then as a kind of dignity I had not expected to still be capable of admiring in her. I understood watching her go that whatever conversation still needed to happen between us would not happen tonight, in front of whoever remained, and that some part of both of us already knew that. Meg found me afterward, sitting alone at the head table, the cake still uncut in front of me. 3 tiers of frosting I had built that morning with my own 2 hands, over a recipe that finally belonged to no one but me. She sat down across from me without saying anything at first. I did not know what to say either. 54 years of knowing exactly how to talk to my daughter, and in that moment I found I had nothing. No recipe for this particular conversation, no 50 years of practiced instinct to fall back on. We sat in that silence for what felt like a long time, the caterers clearing plates from the far tables, the candles burning down lower and lower in their holders. Neither of us in any hurry to be the one who spoke first. "You knew," she said finally. Not accusing, just naming the thing plainly the way she named most things. "I found out 3 weeks ago. And you didn't tell me." "No." She was quiet for a long moment, turning a fork over in her hands, not looking at me. "I saw you close that box. The night I came to find you for supper, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know it would be this." "I'm sorry," I said, and the words felt small and insufficient, set against everything they were meant to carry. "I didn't know how to tell you. I kept trying to find the right way, and there wasn't one, so I kept putting it off, and I let it go on longer than I should have. Why didn't you just ask Mom to tell me herself privately? Why did it have to be like that in front of everyone?" It was the question I had known she would ask eventually, and I had turned it over enough times in the weeks before to have an answer ready, though saying it out loud felt harder than I had expected. Because I was tired of watching this family keep secrets quietly, I said. I've spent 55 years being the last person to understand the shape of my own life. I didn't want you to spend one more year not knowing yours. And I'll admit something else to you if you'll let me. Part of me was afraid that if I told her to tell you privately, she'd find a way to soften it, to make it smaller than it was. The same way she's made everything smaller than it was for 54 years. I wanted you to hear it whole. Meg set the fork down. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wet, though she had not let herself cry yet. Holding it back the way I had taught her, without meaning to hold most things back. He's not my father, she said. Whoever this Desmond is, whatever's true about blood, you're my father. You taught me to crack an egg one-handed. You stood beside me on every line I've ever worked. That doesn't come from whoever happened to be in a room with my mother 54 years ago. I could not answer that. I want to be honest that I tried and found my voice entirely unavailable to me. And so I simply reached across the table and took her hand instead. The same hand I had guided over a mixing bowl when she was 7 years old, and she let me hold it. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything else at all. The caterers moving quietly around the emptying room, the last candles burning low, the uncut cake sitting between us like a question neither of us was quite ready to answer yet. Corinne moved out 3 days after the anniversary to her sister's house in Charleston, taking 2 suitcases and leaving nearly everything else behind, as though the life she had built in that house had never truly belonged to her in the first place, or as though she understood finally that she had no claim left to any of it. I did not go through her things immediately. It took me the better part of a week to work up to it, sorting through the closet in the spare room, where she had kept boxes of old correspondence, tax records, photographs going back decades. The accumulated paper trail of a marriage I was only now beginning to understand in its full dimensions. I found the letter in a shoebox at the bottom of the closet, beneath a stack of Christmas cards tied together with ribbon. It was dated 1994. The paper gone soft and thin at the folds from having been opened and refolded many times over many years. Corinne, it began, in a hand I now recognized. Instantly the same confident slant that had once written a single word in pencil in the margin of a birth certificate. I have thought about this for a long time, and I need to say it plainly. Let me be a father to her. Not in the open, not in a way that touches your life with Wendell, but let me have some claim, some acknowledged place in her life before it's too late for either of us to matter to her. I am not asking you to leave him. I am asking you to let me exist to my own daughter as something other than a stranger. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, the letter in my hands, reading it 3 times over before I trusted myself to fully absorb what it meant. I thought about Desmond, the man I had watched fumble with his keys on a quiet porch, favoring one hip. An old man now. Whatever fire had once been in him, decades gone. I tried to summon anger toward him, reading his own handwriting, asking so plainly to be allowed some small claim on the daughter he had never been permitted to know, and found I could not entirely manage it. Whatever else he had done, whatever damage his presence in Corinne's life had caused mine, this letter read like the words of a man who had wanted at least once to do something honest. There was no reply in the box, no copy of whatever answer Corinne had sent back. But I did not need one to understand the shape of what had happened. Meg had grown up knowing only one father. Whatever Corinne's reasons, protecting the family she had built, protecting Meg from a complicated truth, or protecting herself from finally having to explain any of it, she had chosen at some point in 1994 to keep Desmond at the distance he had always occupied, quiet, unacknowledged, present only in a recipe card and a teapot, and 40 years of carefully hidden payments. I do not know even now exactly how I feel about that decision. Some part of me understood it as a kind of mercy, however imperfect, a woman choosing at least in that instance to protect the daughter's stability over the father's longing to be known. Another part of me understood it as simply one more secret stacked atop all the others, one more decision made on Meg's behalf, without ever once asking what she might have wanted for herself. I wondered whether, given the choice, Meg would have wanted to know him. I did not know the answer, and I understood sitting there that it was not entirely mine to know either. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. I did not know yet whether I would show it to Meg, whether it would comfort her, or wound her further. And I decided, sitting on that closet floor, that it was not a decision I needed to make that particular afternoon. I went down to the kitchen instead, and I took a small slice of the cake I had made for the anniversary, still wrapped and cooling in the walk-in, where I had left it the night everything changed. I cut a thin piece and set it on a plate and stood at the counter alone, in the quiet of a kitchen that had held 55 years of my life, and I tasted it again. It was still right. Still mine, built from my own hands and my own accumulated instinct, owing nothing to a man I had never met until I watched him climb the steps of his own porch 3 weeks before. I stood there a long moment, the fork still in my hand, and I did not say anything out loud, because there was no one there to say it to, and because some things I have come to understand are better held in silence than spoken. I set the fork down. I looked out the window over the sink, where the marsh grass had gone fully gold now, the season finally turning all the way over. And I stood there for a long time without moving, the empty plate in front of me, the house entirely quiet around me, holding something I did not yet have words for, and did not, in that moment, feel any particular need to find them. 3 weeks after the anniversary, on a Sunday when the restaurant was closed and the kitchen sat empty and quiet, in the way it only ever sat on Sundays, I asked Meg to come in early. She found me at the steel counter with the ingredients already laid out. Cardamom and blood oranges, and the good bourbon I kept locked in the office cabinet for occasions that mattered. I had not told her what we were doing. She stood in the doorway a moment, taking in the arrangement, and I watched something soften in her face when she understood. "Is this the cake?" she asked. "The one from the party." "It's a cake," I said. "Not the one you remember, a new one." She came and stood beside me at the counter the way she had stood beside me 1,000 times before, since she was small enough to need a step stool to reach the mixing bowl. And I began to walk her through it, the way my own father had walked me through recipes decades before, mostly by showing rather than telling, letting her hands learn the motions before her mind caught up to naming them. "Cardamom first," I said, "but less than you'd think. It should sit underneath everything else, not announce itself." She measured it out. Careful, precise. The same careful precision I had built into her hands 3 decades before, without either of us fully realizing what we were building. I watched her work, and I found myself more than once simply watching rather than instructing, because there was very little left to teach her that she did not already know. Not about the mechanics of it. What I was giving her that morning was not technique. It was history. The honest kind this time, built from my own hands rather than borrowed from someone else's. "Why blood oranges?" she asked, zesting one carefully over the bowl. "Because I like them better," I said. "That's the low reason. I spent 54 years using the wrong orange because someone told me to, and I never once stopped to ask myself what I actually preferred." She looked at me for a long moment, at that something moving behind her eyes that I understood without her needing to say it, as her beginning to grasp the fuller shape of everything that had happened, not just the facts of it, but the smaller, quieter lesson tucked inside them. We worked through the recipe together for the better part of an hour, creaming butter, folding batter, the particular choreography of 2 people who have spent a lifetime working alongside each other in the same kitchen, needing fewer words between them with every passing year, rather than more. There was a rhythm to it I had not fully appreciated until that morning, watching her hands move beside mine, her instincts so thoroughly mine now that I sometimes could not tell watching her work, where my own training ended and her own judgment began. Whatever blood ran in her, these hands were mine. I had built them the same patient way, motion by motion, that my father had built mine before me. And no pencil mark in any margin could ever unmake that particular inheritance. When the cake finally went into the oven, we sat at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, where the staff usually ate their shift meals, and we did not talk about Corinne or Desmond or anything that had happened in the past month. We talked about the restaurant, about a new supplier for the shrimp, about whether Meg thought we should finally update the dining room chairs. Ordinary conversation, the kind that had carried us through 54 years of ordinary days. And it felt like sitting there with her in that quiet kitchen, like something being rebuilt one steady board at a time. When the cake came out, we let it cool properly, and I cut 2 small pieces, and we ate them standing at the counter, not seated, not formal. The way we had always preferred to taste test anything new. "It's good," Meg said, and I watched her face as she said it. Watched the particular concentration she always brought to tasting something for the first time. "Really good, Dad. This is what it was always supposed to taste like." I did not correct her assumption that the recipe had simply been made correctly at last. I let her have it as she'd said it because in every way that mattered it was true. That evening after she had gone home, I went to the office and took the cedar box down from its shelf. I unlocked it for the first time in weeks, no longer needing to keep anything hidden inside it. And I took out the old recipe card, the one that had never truly belonged to our family, and set it aside in an envelope of its own. I looked at it a long moment before I did that same looping, left-slanting hand that had once seemed to me the shape of an entire secret life. And I felt holding it less anger than I might have expected. Only a kind of tired recognition, the way you recognize an old wound that has finally mostly stopped aching. Then I took a fresh card, and in my own hand I wrote out the recipe as I had made it that morning. The adjusted cardamom, the blood orange, the bourbon glaze, the slower oven, everything I had built from 50 years of my own accumulated instinct, rather than someone else's inheritance. I wrote it slowly, deliberately, the way a man writes something he intends for another set of hands to follow long after his own have stopped being useful for anything at all. I set the new card in the box where the old one had always lived, closed the lid, and for the first time in a month, I did not feel the need to lock it. The cedar box sits on the shelf in my office, still unlocked, the way it has stayed since that Sunday afternoon. Some mornings I open it for no reason at all, just to look at the new card resting where the old one used to live. My own handwriting instead of a stranger's. The teapot with the hairline crack sits in a box in the attic now, packed away with the rest of what Corinne left behind. Though some mornings I still catch myself glancing at the spot on the stove where it used to sit. Then I close the cedar box again and go back to whatever the day requires of me. For 54 years I believed the fault for an imperfect cake lived entirely in my own hands, that I simply was not skilled enough to honor something precious I had been given. I have come to understand it differently now. I was never failing to earn a gift. I was following an incomplete map drawn by someone else, blaming myself for terrain I had never actually been shown. What I know now, standing on the other side of that particular year, is that worthiness was never something to be earned through perfect execution of somebody else's instructions. It was something I had been building all along in every ordinary act of showing up for the people I loved. I think about the years often, the 55 of them, the ones that were true and the ones that turned out not to be. I have talked to God more in these past months than I had in the previous decade combined, asking Him for something I could not quite name at first, some steadiness to carry the weight of what I'd learned. I found that steadiness in the end, not through any single answer God gave me, but through a daughter who chose me anyway, blood or no blood, and through whatever grace God still saw fit to grant an old man learning late in life to finally get a recipe right. I have come to believe that grace looks less like a lightning bolt and more like a Sunday morning ordinary and quiet when you wake up still willing to try. If you were standing where I stood, finding out the sweetest tradition of your life had never quite belonged to you, would you have kept making it anyway? Or would you have let it go and started something entirely new? I still don't know which answer is the braver one, and I suspect there isn't one right answer for every family. Only the one that lets you keep loving the people still standing in front of you. If this story found something true in you, I'd love to hear which choice you would have made and why. Tell me in the comments below. And if you've ever discovered a love in your life was standing on ground you didn't fully understand, know that you are not alone in it, and that the people who choose to stay choose you every single day, whether or